Welcome to the AI Decision Guy podcast, the show where we explore the intriguing balance between artificial intelligence and human decision making. I'm your host, Dr. Carlos Kemeny, and in each episode, we dive deep into the world of AI and its impact on various industries. Dr. Ben Tengelsen is the Vice President of Data Science at IntelyCare, where he leads a team of data scientists and analysts in their mission to generate as much value as possible from IntelyCare's data. Founded in 2014, IntelyCare is the leading tech-enabled nurse staffing platform for healthcare organizations in the United States. Through their AI-based platform, they schedule and match nursing professionals with open assignments across the country. He earned his PhD in economics from Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business, where he studied labor markets, business cycles, and game theory. Okay, well, this is the episode I've been waiting for. I have Ben here, and Ben is a good friend. We oftentimes actually connect during March Madness. I get an email from Ben, and I think data really joins us at the hip, but so does March Madness, and I always lose, so that's always expected. And Ben, I think that you're not last place. That's always expected.
I'm usually like second to last.
Yeah, so that's good. But I, as much as you are better than me at March Madness, you are an incredible data mind, data science brain. I'm excited about today's episode. So thanks for joining us, Ben.
Yeah, super excited to be here. Always a great day when I get to talk to Carlos Kemeny.
Well, it's good. We're gonna just dive in because I feel like there's so much to cover. But maybe to start, let's go through let's talk about your journey and let's go through Wayfair. I mean, you are a marketplace wizard and you did a PhD in economics at Carnegie Mellon. I think you studied pricing optimization there. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but then get into IntelyCare, maybe give us a little bit of a bird's eye view into the work that you're doing right now and transforming nursing and these marketplaces of how to deliver care to folks across the world.
Yeah, sure. So I'll keep it real quick, but went to Carnegie Mellon, did the PhD in economics, studied a lot of random things, and there was a fair bit on labor market matching problems and search frictions. And so how do those matching frictions fluctuate in the face of like credit market frictions or other markets that might demonstrate some search frictions? But also learned a great thing at Carnegie Mellon, which was that I should not be a professor and that my happiest days were all in data and code, and my saddest days were in my dissertation. And that's like as great a lesson to learn from grad school as anything, because it helped me steer my course into industry. Jumped to Wayfair, learned a lot about like day-to-day use cases of machine learning and data science and e-commerce. Was on their pricing team, so I got to keep some of my like economics training and be smart in some conversations while I was like a complete noob in other conversations. And then jumped from there to IntelyCare, where I feel like I'm in a pretty sweet spot to really live in the problem space that I studied as a grad student. And so am, thinking often about search and matching problems as a grad student. And now I get to like work at a company where search and matching is the name of the game. And we are searching and matching together nurses and nursing homes. And for listeners, IntelyCare is a app where nurses can go pick up individual shifts or like a small bundle of shifts at nearby nursing homes. And so it's like, how do you match the nurses with these shifts in a way that's like maximally efficient is what we do. So a fun set of data science problems, a fun set of labor economic problems as well. And it's all happening like every day is a new study, and we get to learn a lot of things. It's cool.
That's right. Yeah, your PhD. Yeah, you were looking at effective marketplace with labor. How does that inform now your view on AI in its ability to create effective marketplaces? So on one hand, you have maybe the more predictable side, which is the demand side, right? Where things are shifting, but people need care, right? Like there's people,
Yeah.
the baby boomers need help, and so now you have nurses that you have to match, but I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the supply side is a little bit more tricky. And in some ways, where you now need to understand people's schedules, their preferences, all of this. And what is the possibilities then of AI and integrating all of this data on a personal level to match and to make decisions on this effective,
Yeah,
marketplace?
I think the short answer to your question is like, how did my training influence how we think about data science and IntelyCare? And like the short answer is that search frictions are a real thing and a big thing as well. And that's true in the labor market generally, but it's also very true in a very like niche labor market as we have. And it's easy to like forget that when you're just looking at the macro data, or if you're even just looking at our data. Um, but when you're like kind of in it every day and you're trying to like reduce your unemployment rate as it would be, um, it becomes pretty clear that like finding good matches for everyone is a really hard thing to do. And it's really easy to come up with like good matches for a small number of people and a small number of nursing homes. Like your best 10% of nurses and your best 10% of nursing homes, really easy to come up with those matches. But like, where do you fit the rest of the puzzle pieces together? And as soon as you like fill one shift, it's off the table, and you're left with fewer puzzle pieces to match together with the nurses that you have. What does it do for like? How does that influence our view of AI? Is I think that it's really the only scalable hope that we have for making big gains in this space. And it's such like a bajillion piece jigsaw puzzle that to do it all by hand, like you have not a prayer of being able to do it well. Or I should say you could do it well, but you'll never be able to like do enough of it to like really scale as a business. And so you need good, smart algorithms that can identify patterns in what people like and in what facilities need and match people together as best you can.
It actually brings me to the memory of Southwest and the issues that they had when this big outage happened, and you had a bunch of people manually trying to schedule these pilots because of all of these issues. And this provides, I think, the hope that you're talking about with AI, which is if you can now create out of great complexity better decision making across these complex landscapes, then that gives us a hope to scale and it hopes to make things much more efficient. I
Yeah.
I'm curious though on choice and the role of choice in a bundle of options in the supply side. So as an example, one thing that we've been studying is GPS and traffic detours, individual decision making around that. How often do you rely on AI or the recommendation, to take the detour route? And actually, for an established technology, we found that not everybody does. There's a lot of people that still defer to their own better judgment because they've been burnt enough times on taking that detour.
Yeah.
And what this has shown is the importance of choice in being able to not necessarily by default accept maybe a recommendation. But what are your thoughts on this role, this critical role of choice, and being able to present a user with some options? Certainly, you recommend in a beautified, maybe a simplified way what the best recommendation would be, but that they still have choice in being able to self-select in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good spot to be in, and maybe even like the best world to be in is when AI is giving you recommendations and you get to consider those recommendations as recommendations and then make your own decisions. I think there's a lot of great things about that type of world. And I think of one example, a conversation that I had with a basketball executive who will remain unnamed, because I'm not sure if this is like a publicly shareable conversation. But let's say this guy is making picks on draft night, and I happen to know this guy. And there was a few years ago, this executive had, I'll say, a top 5 pick, and there were some very hyped players to be picked. My friend knows that I'm like one of these data nerds, and so I'm talking to him one day, and I'm like, so how do you make these decisions? Do you, like, you famously did not go with like the number 1 recommended person. You kind of like did something else and picked someone else instead. Like, what informed that decision? Was it your like little army of PhDs, or was it your gut? And he said, I keep the PhD guys around because they're interesting to talk to and they make me think about a lot of things. But in the end, I went with my gut. And he turned out to make like a famously good decision. And so that was kind of like, take that, you data people, because like the number 1 guy was kind of a dud, and the person that this team went with instead was like now a big superstar. But there are also bad examples. They don't all work out this way. You can certainly, life is full of good and bad choices, whether they're informed by data or not.
Yeah, it's not so probabilistic, right? An individual choice like that. I mean, certainly you have there's a 65% chance that this person is going to be an all-star, right? In this example.
Yeah, for sure.
Where, you have all of the different, their height, maybe the position, how they performed previously. But I think that there is something about that in terms of development. I think any founder, for example, knows that a decision is just the tip of the iceberg, and then the shifts that you make along the way. So like conditioning and a coach and the teammates that surround you certainly are going to influence your growth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's abundant noise, and you only get to live your life once. Like, you only get to see the success of each player once, and everybody's kind of different. And so it is often hard to draw robust conclusions from those things. And often we're kind of stuck with individual anecdotes and be like, well, clearly in this time, because this worked out, therefore, like, human judgment is always better than robot judgment or AI or whatever it is. But it's probably not the case everywhere.
Well, let's push on that a little bit. I know we talked a little bit about, Daniel Kahneman. I mean, you're big. You love this book. I mean,
I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Daniel Kahneman, and here's the most recent book that he's written, Noise, and I highly recommend it. If you've read his more famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, there's, I don't know, maybe like 40% overlap between those books. So he definitely recycles some content from his first book. But in a nutshell, what the book is about is just that human decision making, especially in certain circumstances, can be very noisy in ways that would make most people feel uncomfortable. But there's either not visibility into that data, or it's just kind of like out in the fringes, and it's not, part of a mainstream conversation and hasn't really caught people's attention. So I think, he's writing this book to draw attention to some of these noisy decisions that are made. But because we only live our lives once, and most of us don't, go to court multiple times with multiple judges and see like a pattern of averages, like, it's easy for us to not look into human decision making as flawed or different because we just live it once.
Well, and why is this? I mean, ultimately, the beauty, I think that, maybe let me rephrase, But the point is that let's say that you only have a bounded view of the world because you only have so much access to data, right, in a specific sphere that you have.
Mhm.
And now you open up to AI and there's a lot of data, even in like in the metaverse. This
Yeah.
idea of the metaverse is actually more about centralized data than it is about, some virtual experience, I think. But this idea of like that there is this eye that sees a lot more data and now can prioritize maybe based on what is actually significant in a decision versus what is insignificant based on the access of variables. So omitted variable bias, which I think we learned here is like the cardinal sin of all models. But like, yeah, this is totally true for human decision making because you only have so much access. You don't have all infinite time to go collect data. And if AI does have access to that data, it seems like at least it would have a lot more input than what a human might have in certain decisions. Correct?
Yeah. So I'll read a few bullets from the intro of this book, and I promise I'm not just like this isn't a book report, but he gives a few bullets that I think call out a few industries that I normally don't think of as being subject to a lot of like noise or volatility, and there's a lot of trust that humans are making good decisions. So he says medicine is noisy, child custody decisions are noisy, forecasts are noisy, pretty broad because there's many different forecasts. Asylum decisions are noisy. So whether an asylum seeker will be admitted into the United States depends on something like a lottery. A study of cases found that one judge admitted 5% of applicants, a judge admitted 88% of applicants. And so the title of the study is like just refugee roulette. And it's just up to chance whether you get in or not, depending on who sees your case. Personnel decisions are noisy, so like who you hire and who you interview. Bail decisions are noisy. Forensic science is noisy, even like looking at fingerprints, which I had no idea until I read this book was like, I just thought it was a science because they call it forensic science. And so like, I thought if they got your fingerprint, it's like a done deal. But you can show the same fingerprint to the same forensic scientist a month later in a big stack of fingerprints, and they might not declare it a match as they did when they first saw it. There's a human there that's making a call, like, is it close enough or is it different? And there's noise in those decisions. And then like even patents are noisy as well. So like those are some of the cases that they go into, but it's very unsettling to me to think of things like our justice system or like refugees seeking asylum, that those outcomes are arbitrary based on the human making the decision. And if the judge is like in a good mood or a bad mood, then that influences your outcome. And those are opportunities where data, and I'll say AI in quotes, but it could even just be very simple rules to anchor people to a more like consistent outcome and a more fair outcome, can be a really great thing. But there's also like discomfort with a lot of humans thinking that like if I go to court and I just like fill out a form and send it to a computer and then get my sentence, like that's not a world that most people are excited to live in, even if the outcomes are like demonstrably more fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very true in most organizations too. Like, let's say that you have a hiring decision, right? Like somebody's going to hire someone, and you've just had a bad lunch, right? Like somebody, you didn't eat something very well,
Yeah.
or maybe you just had
I just came out of the worst meeting and now I have to interview this poor person and you're just going to get the worst of me. And it's,
yeah, and like there just isn't synergy, right? And so
yeah,
I think you're driving to an interesting point here, which is uncertainty and the role that it plays in decision making, and maybe not even uncertainty. It's more around the unpredictable, like you said consistency, right? Is
right.
that at least with a model, you have an input, you have an output, it's a predictable thing, right? And so, and even error can be measured, right? And all of this. Whereas
Yeah.
human judgment, in the standpoint of consistency, it would be viewed as very flawed comparatively because we are pretty situational. We are
Right.
contextual.
Yeah.
And this is just how we are as humans. This is part of it. If you're in
Yeah.
a city, as much as we talk about, bias and racial bias, if you're in Chicago or in a Pittsburgh versus a Austin, Texas, situationally, you're attuned to different people in a specific place. When I was in Brazil, I'd go for the summers in Brazil. It's just a different situation. It's a different context. Your brain is trying to adjust to different situations, and that's very complex for a lot of us to do.
Yes, and that's cool of you to even admit that, because I think most of us, when we think about our decision making, we think it's pretty good. And if you want to test that out, just ask anyone you know, like, how do you feel about your diet? And do you think that you have a pretty good diet? And almost anyone you talk to will say, it's pretty good. And that's the answer that you'll get almost every single time. And it doesn't matter who you talk to. Not everybody has a pretty good diet. But when we evaluate ourselves, we tend to be very generous and forgiving of the noise, and it's justified by the situation, and we maybe even project it onto the things and people around us instead of really kind of being attuned to trying to anchor ourselves to a consistent point to make decisions from is a hard thing to do.
Well, and I think this goes to an important point now. So in decision making, if we just like in any business performance, KPI, metric, whatever, you have to measure something many times to improve it. And you have to monitor it, and you have to see the delta. In human decision making, this is very challenging because of the inconsistencies, and because it's, to your point, you have a sample size of one for right, and so now there's not really a thin sample. There's not and so for the social scientists, this drives us crazy because our R-squareds are very low compared to the physical sciences. But here's an important piece of that then. How, if we're going to crack this nut, how do you measure a good decision? What does good judgment mean in terms of a metric? And this is very challenging to do because so many inputs, so many things are not codified. Again, one of the reasons for this idea of the metaverse in many ways is to challenge the paradigm. I tend to not agree with the metaverse because there's a lot of power that's rendered in one space, and that's kind of, that's a different debate. But from the standpoint of measurability of a decision, an AI algorithm is basically measured in its ability to be consistent then, for the most part, in providing an output that's similar across the board. Whereas for a human, this is almost an impossibility.
Yes. And that reducing noise generally is a pretty good thing. And there are some cases where it might not be. If you think of this is a bit of a jump, but go with me here. If you think of biodiversity, if there's only one type of plant in all the world, then you are at risk of some virus just wiping out everything. And so having diversity can be a good insurance against situations changing in the future that would be hurtful. And so certainly some diversity in the human experience is good. And if you're going to be training your AI models, it's also very important to have diversity in your outcomes and experiences as well. But I think the real value in if you really have a good handle on AI and we were using AI to improve decision making and humans are maintained in the loop, then you would be thoughtful about using it in some places, but maybe not all places. And for many people, but not necessarily all people, so that there's, you still want some training data coming in, and you don't want to just train your models on what the model predicted a year ago and 2 years ago and 3 years ago. This is a big question to me, is what will ChatGPT be learning in 10 years when it's generated so much content, and this is it just regurgitates it and cycles it through? And do you end up at some local minimum and hurt your ability to learn in the future because you've eliminated so much noise? it's weird for me to think of that at like the broad, like global level. I'm usually thinking about that in terms of like our shift recommender system or something like that's a lot more like small scale and closed. But when you're thinking about like the robot takeover of the world, I guess you can think of it at this scale as well.
Well, and I think to the individual, it's an interesting contextual question of which is better. There is a philosophical side of this that will never be disentangled from the probabilistic, the consistency question. Certainly, if you're looking for an A to B, then AI in that optimization equation seems to be far better in highly complex situations. The problem then comes down to the Jean Valjeans of the world. I love thinking about AI decision making in terms of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean should have been in jail, and this Javert was absolutely right, and this is what drove him literally insane.
Yeah.
And at the same time, look at the greatness of someone who can change a heart, which is disruptive, maybe probabilistically not likely to happen across offenders, but at the same time, there was that one that did greatness, that became great. And I think in all of us, this is the challenge to AI decision making, is the Cinderella story, the change story, the change of heart story, and all of us want to experience that as part of the human condition. And so therefore, if we start accepting companies that intermediate for the individual, and that's really what companies are becoming, right? The LinkedIn's of the world, they are automating the content that you bring in after you like some,
Yep.
connect with folks. So they're doing that. What about the credit card companies or the banks? They're automating fraud, right? Detection. And so they intermediate for us through trust. We start believing that these algorithms that are driving things that automatically make decisions
Yeah.
for us, that they're good. But the problem here is that the more that we lean upon that, the more dependency that we have. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the risks of AI dependency and the irreversibility potentially of, we start outsourcing decision making to these things. How likely are you capable of being able to make decisions for yourself in a paradigm where you've outsourced a lot of micro decisions?
Yeah, I'll stick mostly within kind of the business lens and then maybe pivot to the more personal lens. But in the context of like approving or denying loan applications, for example, the number of people required to do that manually is very large. The number of algorithms required to do that is, takes a lot of people to build a good one, but at the end, it could just be one, even a very simple algorithm that approves or denies a loan. And so allows you to like operate at a much larger scale. And once you're operating at that scale, it's very hard to walk back because you typically allocate the other people to do other things. And so then it's like, hey, now we need to manually review these. Then you're like, well, I don't have the personnel to do these because people are busy doing other things instead. And maybe there's an appeal process or something that can, like, I don't know, give some sort of second chance for people to have their loan reviewed by a person, and that makes people feel good that they can like have a second chance and be reviewed by a person. And if it's a good person reviewing it, then it could also be good, and it could also be bad in that like you maybe pick out some Cinderellas, but you can also like give loans to what's like the opposite of Cinderella, someone like a Ursula or someone like some other some like villain or something like that is a potential outcome as well. But at least you have the recommendation of the algorithm, and at least you have the data from the application. And so hopefully the person reviewing this isn't going to like just flip a coin or like spin around in their chair and be like, yes, no, or like their deviation from the mean is probably small in a way that makes the risk of human decision making smaller as well. And so yeah, it's a trade-off. Like when you have a lot of variance, you can get these like really cool success outliers, which are very like inspirational. They don't make a lot of like books or Disney movies about like the outliers on the opposite end. Well, maybe they do. They show up in like crime documentaries or something of like the guy, Catch Me If You Can, or something, like the guy who gets a loan, but it turns out he's like a total scammer. This can happen as well. And I mean, you can potentially fool an algorithm as well as a human if you can like study it and figure it out. I mean, it depends a lot on the algorithm, I guess.
Well, and I think what this lends itself to in this new age is observability, rule setting, deliberate planning.
Mhm.
Because, and I'll use an example, you've made me think of a wonderful experience trying to get my appraisal adjusted for the city, Travis County in Austin, Texas, when I had a certain value placed on my home, and it was a lot of money that it was going to be in taxation. And so I did all of my research. Can you believe that? I was, working at a university. I thought, gee, maybe if I go there and I debate my case with some multiples and hard data on the comparables, then they will clearly see with a
Mhm.
good story that I'm right and that they were wrong in their appraisal. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. I went with the multiples and it showed, I think it was like a 5% less value than what they had appraised it for. And they gave no reason in rejecting my comparables. It was
Yeah.
blasphemous to me. I
Yeah.
couldn't
Yeah. Yeah.
believe it. The
Well,
institution had been set up using these, and this for the social planner, the model was absolutely efficient because now you only had a certain percentage of the population that would come and debate, but very small percentages of people, regardless of the story, regardless of the comparables, regardless of the data, were had a positive outcome to what they were
Mhm.
trying to do. Now, what I did find out, unfortunately, is that corruption is how you win these things. You have to know someone. You have to circumvent the process, and so now
Yeah.
the rules of the game are favoring those who know how to game the system. And I think this is the biggest risk that we have. It is the exact same experience that I had, which I felt unfair.
Yeah.
I had data in my head. I had all of these proof. I gave a good story. In fact, Ben, I probably gave the best pitch that day or that
The
quarter. I'm convinced. I had
It
practiced it.
might be the best pitch they ever heard.
Probably,
Yeah.
probably. And yet, when I asked them, when they said we are going to reject this, I said why, and they said, "Well, just because." They couldn't even fathom that I
Yeah.
would ask them such an audacious question. And so, to me, I think I learned an important lesson that day, which is the rules of the game and the transparency become exalted in the AI model world of decision making, where the justification and the rules of the exception must be set for there to be fairness and for people to actually move forward with that as a community or a society before rejecting
Yeah.
outright. And that's one
Yeah.
of the challenges, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is why, like, when I put AI in quotes, it could also be simple rules. Like, if your appraisal is equal to your square footage times 5 plus your, whatever, like, if those are all laid out in an equation, a good example of this is congressional seat allocation based on population. Like, the equation is just there. There's no, we do not debate. Like, we debate about how and the census occurs, and politicians will try and like change how we count people. But once the people are counted, there is very little debate around like how many states get how many Congress people. And that's like a delightfully boring thing because it's just an equation. It's just there. Like, there's nothing to discuss. It's set. The and that would be nice to have that in other aspects of our life because of the transparency and the explainability of it, and that fairness feels good. Like, it feels nice to be treated fairly, and algorithms can do a good job of being fair. They can also, and you and I are probably thinking of many of the same counterexamples, they can also be like consistently unfair, or like you've removed a lot of the noise, but you're biased, and you are like, instead of being, I don't know, wrong like 50% off 10% of the time, now you're like 100% off 5% of the time, or like in some way you're just like, anybody who looks a certain way or lives in a certain zip code is like consistently shut out, and that obviously is bad.
Well, and it's also not
Can
optimal.
also be bad, and so we're if we can get the best of both, and I do believe that we can, then we, embrace AI for what it's good at, take its recommendations as recommendations, uh, let good people, and this is like probably where it all unravels, is like, let good people who don't accept bribes review the recommendations of that, and, depart from your GPS recommended course where they know a shortcut because they've traveled this many times, and, can consistently beat it, then we have a better world to live in, I think.
I think so
Um,
too. I think that what's interesting about your case about maybe the favorable unfair, so or not the favorable erroneous, non what is it? It's suboptimized, right? I was connecting with a telecom company because the internet went out, and I learned that if I had chatted and said a few words, they would automatically offer me $30 credit. And so I did that once, and then I did it a second time, and it did the same thing. And so
yeah,
I realized that you can also game through the
yeah,
automation. I thought, oh, this is
yep,
great. This is wonderful. I don't want to talk to anybody
yeah,
anyway. And
yeah,
$30 sounds great. It sounds like it's compensating me fairly for my time. And so you have that situation where maybe it's erroneous, right? But then there's the other side of this bias, which now it's unfair. And I think what it lends itself to for an optimal system is transparency on the model. If in the approval process or the rejection, they had said, well, these are the variables that we consider. These is the data. To get a different decision, you must provide 20 within the last 2 months. And that is
yep,
what we legislatively agreed to in this county. That is a very different equation than you're in a room. And if you know somebody, you're going to get a favorable response versus an
yeah,
unfavorable one. And I think this is the challenge, I think, of our society going forward with decision making in AI. Part of this is driven by the fact that there can be some transparency, and there should be with any type of public algorithm that's used for these types of social planning decisions. There should
uh-huh.
be transparency to the algorithm so that
One,
one can absolutely have um, a certain outcome when they approve, so that you can battle data with data and using the same algorithm. The problem now comes down to the unsupervised side, and this is the much more complex issue, is when folks at OpenAI have no idea what the output's going to be tomorrow than it was today. And so now and of course, there's also trade secret protection, and that brings a whole nother layer of
yeah,
complexity.
yeah,
But the idea around where is it really that uncertain? Or has it removed that much uncertainty? And I think that is, I think, the big question that we face in the next decade is how much uh, uh, dependency we can have on the certainty of different models anyway.
I think the transparency is also valid for the human decision making, and that is a big recommendation of Kahneman generally, is like, when you're evaluating people to hire, that you like score them on consistent things and you ask them consistent questions, and it's like maybe less of a fun conversation to interview someone in that way, but like then you have transparency, and they say like, why did you hire this person? You can say, well, because their uh, technical abilities were a 5 out of 5, and because their uh, I don't know, maybe I didn't hire them because their uh, communication was a 0 out of 5 or something like. But you have data, even if it's come out of your head, you've still kind of like imposed that rule of transparency on your decision making, and you will make different decision makings when you operate in that framework, and you like kind of prepare to be audited for the decisions that you're making. uh, then yeah, you can imagine that uh, a lot of, you know, think of criminal justice, if you think of like asylum, if you think of uh, a lot of these, fields that we mentioned earlier, like those could operate very differently if with every decision that you make, you have to like fill out in a way like a scorecard or something that like justifies the decision that you made. And you're right, you do run into like some frictions operating at like a corporate level or something where it's like, hey, our model is our model and we don't like reasonably can't just like publish it as a scorecard that's open to the world to see, because then like we can't charge you $2 every time that you call our API. But yeah, maybe there are ways that you can still audit those types of systems. And many people like talk about AI as a black box that's difficult to understand. And in many ways it can be, and some models are more opaque than others. And I guess my like plea for any listeners is that we hold that in comparison to human decision making, which can be equally a black box, and that we kind of reach for the best in both and not just like categorically dismiss AI because we don't understand it, and instead like put it to the same level of scrutiny, like put ourselves under the same level of scrutiny that we put these AI systems, and then go with what's best.
I think that's a great summary of this conversation. I think that this recommendation of elevate the accountability, transparency, and auditability or observability of your own decision making, and to figure out how to optimize decision making with AI first. I think that certainly there will be contextually a movement to automate, just because that's what we do. We're half the least people.
Yeah.
But I think that ultimately, this recommendation of let's improve the pieces of both, and that will elevate our decision making period, and it will also help to differentiate when to use AI, when it's okay to use AI for decision making, versus when we should hold those cards closer and make those decisions for many reasons as humans, right?
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
That's good. I think that we've solved the world's problems. Ben, thank you for joining today. I clearly enjoyed this, but I thank you for thanks for a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, great time, Carlos.
Thank you for joining us on the AI Decision Guy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show, and be sure to tune in to our future episodes as we continue to explore the ever-evolving landscape of AI and its impact on decision-making. Until next time.